You've probably heard designers talk about the grid, but if you're not a designer yourself, that term can sound kind of confusing and abstract. So that's why when anybody asks me about it, I always try to simplify it as much as possible. A grid is just a framework of evenly spaced lines that helps you organize and align content. Instead of an infinite number of sizes, the grid helps you narrow it down to a reasonable amount of choices. This makes your designs more consistent because you're using a uniform set of sizes, and you create balance through aligning things properly and giving a relationship between your elements. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through a 12-column grid, which is probably the most popular in web design, so that you can realize all of these benefits of the grid. If you're ready to level up your designs, then stick around and let's get started. So here in Figma, I've gone ahead and just brought in a bunch of assets that I would need to build out a blog post template, and we're going to use this as our case study to use the grid here inside Figma. So what we need to do first is use the frame tool, which you can get to by pressing F on your keyboard or clicking this button down here in your toolbar. And then over on the right hand side, I like selecting this MacBook Pro 16-inch, and when we drop that in here, it goes right into our artboard. Now I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out a little bit taller because I know we're going to need the vertical space in here. Now to set up our grid, all we need to do is make sure we're selecting that frame, and over here on the right hand side, we're going to click Layout Grid. Now by default, it's going to give us this 10 pixel grid. This is great if you're designing something really small like icons or something like that, but what we're after is a column approach. So I'm going to click that settings there, and I'm going to drag this to the middle of the screen so we can look at it, and I'm going to change this from grid to columns. Now by default, it's going to give us 5 columns that stretch the width of the page. But here in this case, we're actually going to be using a 12 column grid. Now you don't have to use 12 columns, but it probably is the most popular convention. And that's because 12 is divisible by 2 and 3 and 4 and 6, meaning you can make some even columns out of 12 pretty easily. Now, by default, this is going to be set to stretch, which means our grid goes all the way from the edge of our viewport, but we're going to be using a 1280 pixel content width, meaning our content isn't going to stretch to the ends of the screen. So we're actually going to want to set this to center. Now, by default, it's giving us a column width of 10 and a gutter of 20. I go ahead and set the gutter first. Now, I typically work off of an 8-point grid or an 8-point scale. So I'll go with 16 for my gutter because 8's a little bit too skinny for me. Now, basically what you need to do at this point is to do some math to figure out how wide your columns need to be in order to get you to your content width. Like I said, I'm going to be using 1280 as my content width. We're going to have 12 columns, and the gutter between them is 16. So what I need here for the width is 92 pixels, which if we go ahead and close that out, I'm just going to grab our rectangle here, and we'll draw from one edge of our grid, make sure we're lined up perfectly on those marks, and you'll see that over here in our dimensions, we're set at 1280. So now with this grid in place, we have our 1280 content grid, and we have 12 even columns with 16 pixels of gap in between each of them. We can easily toggle on those grids by pressing Shift G on our keyboard, and that will toggle them on and off. Right now I have the color of those grids pretty dark. We can always go back and change that. If we select our frame and press these layout grid settings, you can go in here and change the grid color and also the opacity of it. Often when I'm working on a Figma project, I'll drop this down to 2 or 3%, so it's very, very faint on my screen, but I still have use of the guidelines that come up. However, I know in the screen share that's going to make it hard to see, so I'm going to bump it up to 10 just so you guys can see it easily. I find it distracting a lot of times when I'm designing, so you'll probably see me turn them off and on quite a bit. Now, just to make this more realistic and so we can kind of get the scale of the website, I'm going to go ahead and paste in a header here that I made in a separate page, and we'll push it to the top of the page there. So this way we have some kind of anchor for this page, which is just this typical navigation here. So now we need to start deciding how we're going to bring all this content in and how we want to lay things out. So we'll just start with this big heading for our blog post here, and I'll go ahead and just center it in the page here. Now, I probably don't want this headline to stretch the full content width here. That seems pretty wide. So I'm going to turn off the grids here and just show you. Let's say on this one, maybe we're going to go with a centered alignment for this hero section. So without the grids, you're kind of left guessing at how wide to make this. And maybe you come up with this size or this size, but you basically have an infinite number of sizes within that 1280 pixels to make the width of this element. However, if we turn our guides back on, we're narrowed down to these 12 different column widths. So I could bring this in here and say maybe it's 10 columns wide, as we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 columns this is spanning right now. Or maybe if that's still too wide, I bring that in and say it's 8 columns. To me, that's looking a little too narrow for such a large font size, so I think we were on a better track when we had this at 10 columns wide. Now, to save us from continually counting all these columns, I'm just going to drop in these numbers across the top of the screen just so we know which column numbers we're talking about. I wouldn't necessarily do this during a design project, but I think it'll make it easier to communicate during the tutorial. Okay, so I think that's a good starting place for our headline. Let's go ahead and bring our excerpt. Since we're doing kind of a center aligned headline, I'm going to go ahead and center align our excerpt as well. And we'll just center it on the screen here. Now this text is quite a bit smaller in font size, so my thinking is I'm probably going to want this even smaller as far as how many columns it takes up. So if we went the same as the headline, we're still letting this span all the way across. I think 8 columns probably makes more sense for this excerpt. Obviously, we're only looking at one set of content here. This is going to be dynamic and it's going to change based on the blog post. So we might have some that are longer and some that are shorter, but I think making sure this doesn't ever span across these 8 columns is going to work pretty well for us. We'll go ahead and drag in our featured image next. And I do like the look of this featured image taking up the full column width. So obviously with no grids on, we could just go in here and play with how big we might want this image to be. But the grids give us a place to start with. So let's put this back to our full column width here. I'm going to toggle those grids off. I kind of like that. That makes the image really stand out. It takes up a big piece of the real estate. But let's take a look at what it might look like if we made it smaller. So we'll bring it in here maybe to 8 columns like our text. That works as well. It's probably not the impact I would be going for. We'll bring it back to our 10 columns. I think this works really well too, but I think for this piece, I want to go ahead and bring this out to all the way to the edge to my full 12 columns. Now, this might be a little bit tall just because we're starting to take up a lot of vertical space. If we were to zoom in here to 100% and look at this as if it was a real website inside of our browser, I think this proportion for the image looks pretty good. We could maybe go a little bit skinnier. I want to be conscious of the different images that we'll be putting in here. Not everything is going to be super landscape like this, almost panoramic looking. So we need to be careful that we don't make it too skinny. However, I just want to make it obvious that there's the content underneath this. So I just don't want to make it too big where people can't tell that there's text underneath it. So I think something around there looks pretty good. Now we'll work on all the vertical spacing here in a little bit. Right now I'm just trying to get these things on the page and fit them into my grid. I'll go ahead and delete this image since I ended up making a copy of it. We have this metadata that we're going to need up here. We also have some of these little graphic elements that we're going to incorporate into our design. But I think the next thing I want to look at is the body copy of this blog post. Let's go ahead and drag this into our artboard here. I think we're going to need to make our artboard even bigger, so I'm going to go ahead and stretch that out a little bit. Now for body copy like this, you really don't want this to ever stretch the entire width of a website. It makes it really hard to read. Typically when I'm developing, I will use the CH unit or the character unit so I can limit how many characters wide something is. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that here inside Figma, but just based off experience, knowing we're using an 18-point font, anywhere between like 600 and 800 pixels wide is usually pretty comfortable. So I'm going to be keeping an eye over here on the dimensions as I start scaling this in. Now I'm just holding the Option key on my keyboard, which is going to scale it in from both sides equally. If we get here to our 8 columns, we can see that that's 848 pixels. That still might be a little bit too wide. We're kind of pushing it there. So I think I'm going to bring this all the way in to 6 columns wide. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At that point, we're at 632 pixels, which I think is a very comfortable distance for reading. So if we know we're going to have this about 632 pixels, that might give us some kind of anchor for bringing in all that metadata. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring in our author name, and we'll bring in this publish date here. Now we could decide to put this up above the featured image or below it, but I think I'm going to anchor it down here below, just above our copy. So we'll go ahead and left align that author name here on the same column where all of our body copy comes in. And you might be tempted to go ahead and left align this publish date right next to it on this column. And this is one of those cases where I start to kind of ignore the grid. A big part of that is because the author's name is probably going to change. Right here we have Chris Soundwave, but we might end up with a much shorter or much longer name, which will change the gap in between these two elements. Really, I'm more concerned with the spacing in between these elements than I am these elements sitting on their own inside the grid. So instead of trying to align this perfectly to the grid, I'm going to grab both of these elements here by holding Shift and clicking both of them. And then I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard, which is going to turn this into an auto layout. At that point, I'm able to change the gap in between these elements. Like I said, I typically use a 8-point grid, so I'm going to change this to 40 pixels, which was pretty close to how I visually laid it out. I just wanted to make sure I was landing on something divisible by 8. So with that in mind, we can kind of clean up this spacing a little bit. Like I said, we'll work on that vertical spacing further down in the video. I'm just going to make sure that these are evened out here and see how things look proportionally just to my eye. Still looks like this gap might be pretty big, so we'll just go ahead and bring that in a little bit more. And now we can grab our social shares. So I think these ones we could just right align in this same content area, the same 6 columns. We could just grab this and right align it to the edge of this column. And this kind of anchors all this content together. So if I grab all these social share icons, we have a gap that's in between all of them. I'm not sure exactly what that is. So I'm going to turn this into an auto layout as well by pressing Shift A. And we can see there's 18 pixel gap in between all these. I'm going to bump that down to 16. I'm going to make sure that's still right aligned across my grid here. Click the date and author information and Shift A again. And here I'm just going to use the auto gap in between them, which is basically space between if you're using Flexbox. So now we have a 40 pixel gap in between the author name and the published date, and then whatever gap is left over here, since these dates and names will be a little bit dynamic. Now looking at this and turning off my grid, it almost feels like this is floating a little bit too much, and I want it to be anchored over here with the name. So I think our 40 gap is a little bit too big. We could try 32 or even 24. 24 looks pretty good to me, and that makes it more obvious that the author name and published date are kind of grouped information, and the social share information is kind of pushed off to the side. So I think that's where I want to take that one. Now, the next thing we need to put in this post is all of our latest articles or related posts. And this is going to go at the bottom of our blog post. So if the reader makes it down to the bottom of the blog post, we can keep them on the page and keep them engaged with other content they might want to read. Now we have 4 different articles here, so let's remember that. We're going to try to fit 4 articles into our layout. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and grab one of them. We can always manipulate this one and duplicate it later just to make it easier so we're not having to repeat the same process over and over again. Now we could just set these in the grid here. I know they're not perfectly spaced, but just to give us an idea, 4 fit across, but I think this is much too small when we look at this in the context of the entire blog post. These really feel like tiny little thumbnails, and I'm not sure they would get the attention I want. So I'm gonna go ahead and back that up, and we'll turn our grid back on. I think instead of putting these side by side, I'm actually gonna stack them on top of each other. Now, one of the benefits of this 12 column grid is that it's divisible by 2 and 3 and 4 and 6. So we know that this image could take up 2 columns, it could take up 3 columns, it could even take up 4 columns here, and it would be 3 cards wide. However, I think I'm going to go with 3 columns here. Obviously, we've messed with the proportion of this photo, so I'm just going to bring it back into something fairly reasonable. I think that looks pretty good. I'll often use an aspect ratio on these, but we're not going to get into those fine details here. So let's just zoom in, and we'll use our grid here as our guide to make sure that this heading is also 3 columns wide, and that this date has the ability to span 3 columns wide as well. Zooming out here, it looks like the text for this title, yeah, it's set to 16 points, which is even a little bit smaller than our body copy here. I think I'm going to bump this up to 20 just to make it a little bit more prominent. And we can use auto layout as our friend again here just to make sure we have even spacing. We'll change that to 16, and then the space between the text and the image, we'll change that to maybe 24. So now if we took this entire card here, we can duplicate it across our screen, making sure that it just lines up with our grid. And we see what this might look like if we had 4 columns wide with the image stacked on top of the text. And I think this works pretty well as featured images across the bottom. I think we do need to bump down the space a little bit, and we can bring in this headline that says latest articles. Now, the size of this looks a little bit off too. I'm probably going to bump this up to maybe 28. And that'll give us a good little headline for all these other articles. Now, the last thing we need to bring into this post are these little design accents. We can see this kind of matches their logo, and it's going to make it a little bit more friendly and playful. We just have to figure out exactly where we want to put them. Now, we have to be conscious of the fact that all this information is dynamic. What we're looking at here is going to change based on the text of the blog post. So I think we have to center this around the layout more than we do the actual words we're seeing. Now I'm going to turn this grid back on here, but I think with design accents like this, now we kind of have the freedom to break out of this grid some. We don't necessarily need to take this design accent and line it perfectly up and make sure it's perfectly sized with a column here. At this point, we have a little bit more freedom. So what I'm thinking is we use these design accents around this featured image here just to put a little bit of character into it. So we're going to put this over on the corner here. I'm going to turn my grids off so we're not even bothered by those right now. And maybe this is kind of like a sheen on this top right corner. And then we could take these little diamonds and make sure maybe they overlap a little bit onto the featured image here and just kind of frame in the two opposite corners of that. Obviously, the color isn't working for us really well right now. There's not a whole lot of contrast here, but I'm less worried about colors right now and just more worried about getting this layout down. But I think something like this works perfectly well. If we turn our grids back on, we can see that everything here is lining up nice with the grid, and without the grids on, since visitors are never going to see these kind of invisible lines, everything just looks nice and balanced. And instead of choosing from an infinite number of widths, we narrowed our choices down to these 12 different columns so we could keep things in proportion with one another. Now the last thing we need to do is just make sure our vertical spacing works well. For this, I'm going to go ahead and turn off our guides here, and we're going to use auto layout again. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab this headline and the excerpt, which are two pretty closely related pieces of content here, and I'm going to use Shift A to create an auto layout. We see by default these were at 56 pixels. To me, this looks maybe like a little bit too much gap, so let's see what this looks like at 40. I think 40 brings those in pretty nicely together. Now I want a gap in between this group of content here and this featured image, and I probably want that gap to be bigger than the gap that's in between here. So I'm going to make sure I grab this auto layout and we'll grab our image here. And again, I'm going to hit Shift A, kind of working from the inside out as I build all these auto layouts. Now this one here is at 55, which isn't quite on my 8-point grid. So I'm going to change that to 56, which is divisible by 8. And we can see that the gap in between this text here and the image is a little bit bigger than this. Those different size gaps really shows the reader which things are related. It's not that this information isn't related to the featured image, but these two things are more closely related, and we can show that relationship through the proximity here. Now, since we used 56 pixels in between this information and this featured image here, I think we want to do the same thing in between the featured image and this metadata down below it. So I'm going to grab this entire frame here. We'll grab this metadata here and we'll do another Shift A. Again, I just want to bump this to 56, and I think we just evenly space out the text as well. So I'm going to select it, Shift A again. We'll change this to 56. Now, as we get down here to the bottom, maybe we have an author bio or something like that, but for now, we'll just go without that information. Now, all of this information is much more closely related than this down here at the bottom, so I know I'm going to want a bigger gap in between the content of this blog post and these related articles. So again, I kind of want to work from the inside out. I have all these auto grid on their own. I'm going to auto grid those together. We can see they have a gap of 16. We'll auto grid them with the latest articles. Look like something shift there, so I want to make sure I'm still on my grid lines. I think our latest articles is taking up too much space there, so we'll just make sure that that's bumped in. And now everything should work perfectly. So now we have this entire section here kind of as its own unit, and we want to create an auto layout between it and the rest of the content. So again, I'm going to select both of those and hit Shift A. That's create us an auto layout. Now we can see this already has a gap of 116, which I think visually looks pretty good, but I'm just going to bump this down to 112, which probably isn't going to make a huge difference here, but then it's going to make sure to follow my 8-point grid. Again, we'll just go ahead and turn off our grids here so we can look and see how everything's turned out. I think we're done with our columns here, so we'll just hide that. And everything here looks nice and balanced and in proportion. Now, of course, this isn't the only layout you're going to come up with a 12-column grid. You really have a million different possibilities. The grid just helps kind of set a foundation and a structure for your post. Just to show you what I mean, I'm going to go ahead and paste in 2 other designs I did here. We'll turn off our grids for a moment, and I'll turn these backgrounds to white just so we make sure we can see them easily. Now here we've kind of gone with a left aligned look. You can see here the headline spans a little bit further than everything. Our image kind of breaks out of the box a little bit as far as our content here. But if we turn on our grids, we can see everything's aligning perfectly with our grids here. All of this is, of course, left aligned across the left side of our content width. But our text here is going to 10 columns. This excerpt is going to 8. All of our content here is going to 6 columns wide, but our featured image pops out into 8. And we're using these 3 columns on the side again to create kind of a mini grid for our related posts. So these are just stacked one on top of each other, kind of in a sidebar layout. And if we look at this option here, again, we'll turn off our grids. This one's definitely a much shorter layout. We've kind of packed everything into the horizontal a little bit better. We have our featured image over here on the right-hand side with our heading and meta information on the left. And then our content below that, our social share is kind of floating on this left column, and our related post over here on the right. But again, if we turn on the grids, we'll see that this image is perfectly aligned with this grid in here. Our text is taking up these 5 columns over here on the left-hand side. Our social share stuff is going here in our content width, but our content is actually brought in 1 column inside of it. Now, without those grid lines on, you'd probably never know that, but all of this content does really look in proportion and spaced out nicely. So here you can see that the 12 column grid can give us tons of different layouts, and it doesn't really limit your creativity. It just gives you a framework to live within, so you make sure things are proportionate with one another and that you're using some consistent sizes across your designs. Hopefully this explanation helps simplify things a little bit and take a little bit of mystery out of the grid. It is really a handy tool when you're going in here and designing things, especially in Figma, so you can really nail down all those proportions. Of course, once you understand how the grid works, that's when the magic really happens, when you start breaking the grid and getting a little bit more creative. It's not to mean that everything exactly needs to fit the grid, nor that nothing ever needs to touch the grid. There's a balance between these two things, and once you know where the lines are, it's a whole lot easier to paint outside of them. Hopefully you got something great out of today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.